What is up, everyone? Welcome back to Stvi and Skippy, the only channel where our co-host has four legs and has zero interest with HDR. Say hi, Skippy. No, very professional as always. Just rotate you here so our audience can see you. All right. So GTA 6 is coming up, hopefully now on November finally. And if this has got you thinking if you want to upgrade your setup, particularly your TV, then this video is for you. So we recently got gifted by my wife the PS5 Pro, and ever since we've still been using our Sony Bravia X90H, which is also a 55-inch 4K 120Hz screen. And meanwhile, we've actually been an OLED household for quite a while now. We've had our LG C2 48-inch, which is currently being used by my wife for work. And now we've had our LG GX950A, which is this 5K 2K ultra wide that we are mainly using for our gaming PC. So the question became obvious, why not we upgrade our main TV too? And so we made the jump to the LG C5 55-inch, and so we will break it down if it's actually worth it. So we've had the X90H for about 5-6 years now. We bought it back in 2020 when the pandemic hit. That was also around the time we managed to snag a PS5 through one of those sign-up lotteries everyone was doing back then. The X90H wasn't really the best at the market during that time, but the timing was good. We upgraded to something with 4K 120Hz, specifically to pair with the PS5, and it was a great combo back then. So what pushed us to go get an OLED for the main TV now? It's kind of the same story playing out again. We just got the PS5 Pro, upgrading from the base PS5, and we wanted to actually maximize it. Same reasoning as before, just one console generation later. And since we've already been living the OLED life on our other screens for a while, it just made sense to bring our TV, main TV up the same level. So why LG specifically? Essentially, it's because the C series is one of the most popular OLED lines out there, and it's relatively budget friendly while still being the top notch on performance and also gaming features. So honestly, turning on the C5 the first time wasn't really that of a big shocking reveal for us, because as may have mentioned, this isn't our first OLED, but it was still pretty much within expectation. It has that glossy great color, and the blacks are honestly astonishing, especially next to a VA or an LED panel like the X90H. So in terms of the budget, so the C5 ran us at about 65,000 pesos this year. Actually, just we got this quite around a few months ago. And we actually looked at the C6 too, since it's the newest model, but that's sitting at around 80,000 pesos. And from what I researched, the difference between the C5 and the C6 isn't that much big of a difference. It's like it has a cap at 165 hertz versus the 144 hertz of the C5 in terms of the refresh rate, but in terms of like the VRR, ALLM, the HDMI 2.1, it's really mostly the same core gaming specs. So the C5 made a lot more sense for us to get. And then for comparison, the X90H cost us around 56,000 pesos back in 2020. Specifically, we got it from Anson's. So we're really talking only at about 9,000 pesos difference, or around 150 US dollars for a big generational jump from VA to an OLED. So that's not really bad at all. And the C5 being a year old now, since the C6 already out, it means that there's already some discount room on it too. So is this a save up territory, or only if it drops kinds of scenario? Honestly, if you already had the budget for like the X90H back then when it launched, so you probably already have the budget for an OLED more or less. So yeah, there's an OLED tax for it, and that is real. But again, if you're already on that spending tier list, so you might as well just go for OLED. So the X90H was genuinely great when we got it back then. As far as I know, 4K wasn't even that common back then, and it paired perfectly with the PS5. At the time, the colors looked perfect to me because I didn't have really anything to compare it against yet, just on my cheap, I guess, 4Ks that we had back then. But once you've lived your life using OLED, so you're never really going back to LCD or LED for that matter. The big difference is the blacks. So on the X90H, you're always seeing a bit of backlight glow behind dark scenes. It never really goes to a true screen is off black, and that OLED gives you that per pixel true black instead. But here's something I want to flag though, and it's not something that I expected to notice. So the X90H has actually started developing a bit of a dirty, darker patch around the corners over the years. So the local dimming or the backlight of the X90H is starting to show a bit of its age as well. And I guess it's worth saying that the LCDs aren't also safe from aging technically, like the way we had with the OLED panels wherein we are potentially can have burn-ins. So same goes for LCDs, nothing's really safe essentially. As for the panel finish, so as for me personally, I am a glossy kind of guy over matte. The glossy has more glare and reflections, sure, but that's something you can actually control with lighting or the positioning of your TV or your monitor. Base image quality isn't something that you can fix after the fact, so glossy wins for me overall. Brightness-wise, C5 is noticeably brighter compared to the X90H, especially for HDR. The X90H is around 600 to 700 more or less in terms of HDR peak brightness. Meanwhile, the C5 has around 1000 to 1200 nits HDR peak brightness. And then in terms of viewing angles are more or less the same for us, and it doesn't really matter based on how we use the TV or how we actually watch on it. Our living room is pretty small, so we just watch mostly directly facing it or just a bit to the side, like when I'm washing the dishes here, for example. So for the OLED burn-in, so this is where we pull out the LG C2 that my wife is currently using for work. It's the previous gen series from LG, so it's a fitting comparison. We've had it for about 2 years now, and she's been running a fixed 4-quadrant window layout with power toys the whole time for work. So the burn-in that's shown up is exactly where you'd expect it. There's a hint of gray lines running along the center horizontal and vertical axis, right where those window borders sat every single day. And to be fair, OLED is not the only tech that shows its age. As I mentioned earlier, the X90H got that corner clouding, and that's the LED backlight aging. And it's not something that you can really prevent the way we do with the OLED, like there's pixel shift or screensavers that we use for OLED. So different tech, different trade-offs, but neither TV is really safe from the aging. So gaming features. So honestly, the LG C5 doesn't really feel noticeably snappier when compared with the X90H. Even though the OLED's response specs are much better on paper. And part of that is because the X90H has a decent game mode handling on its own already. Both TVs support 4K 120Hz and HDMI 2.1, and both support eARC if you're running a soundbar. And I believe the X90H already has a VRR and ALLM added on it via a firmware update way back in 2021, although it wasn't a perfect implementation, I believe, so it had some issues around it. Like the VRR disables the local dimming, so you would notice that it's noticeably dark when you're using VRR on that. So it's a trade-off that I didn't really bother using. We just essentially just turned game mode on, and that was it. So on the front, they're more or less the same really. It's just the implementation of that VRR is not that polished in terms of for the X90H. And for context, our living room TV setup is console only. We have the PS5, now the PS5 Pro. We have the Switch 2 back then, and now the Switch 2. So no PC gaming happens on this TV, and that stays on our dedicated gaming monitor elsewhere. And we didn't really want a bulky PC setup that's here on our living room or on the console. So the X90H's game mode is pretty basic. It's just really a toggle that improves our response time versus standard mode, and you can genuinely feel the input lag difference if you forget to turn it on. Meanwhile, the C5's game optimizer is a much fuller dedicated gaming menu, so it has more settings, more visibility into what's actually happening, like the FPS counter, the VRR status, ALLM, black stabilizer, and others. So for the refresh rate though, the C5 is native up to 144 Hz compared to previous models, which is 120 Hz, and also compared to X90H, which is also only at 120 Hz. But it's not a much of a difference, honestly. I don't think you'll be able to see the difference with the human eye between 120 Hz and the 144 Hz. And so before we go to the next section of our review, here's a quick side-by-side comparison when gaming between the C5 and the X90H.
Should be around here.
Do I sound like I care?
It's fine. I only just found him.
Who's Kevin?
He's late too.
Yes, another. Nice table.
Really? What the hell is the matter this week?
So, what happened with the missus?
Oh man, she was pissed. She forgave me in the end.
Now for our day-to-day use and feature sets of the TVs. Honestly, the WebOS of LG C5 is quite confusing at first. A simple example here is wanting to switch to the HDMI 1 to the HDMI 2 using the C5's controller. So on the C5, the same remote button now defaults to opening the home hub, and you have to hold it down just to get to the input switch menu. On our old C2, that button was a dedicated standalone input switch button. It's just a single click and you're done. Now LG merged these two functions into one button on the C5 and made the one we use constantly the slower one to access. So that's really a real regression for us and not just me being picky. As for the general menu, responsiveness on the C5, it is fine and responsive, unlike the old smart TVs that are a bit sluggish to navigate through. So it's specifically this one input switch flow that's really our pain point for this TV. Then out of the box, the C5's home screen comes with bloatware like ads and unwanted apps that we don't really use. We had to go digging through the settings to clean it up and deleting the unnecessary apps we don't really use, such as Copilot here. The X90H Android TV felt cleaner and more familiar right away. It's probably due to the fact that we're already an Android or Samsung household day to day. Now, as for AI, honestly, I get it that AI is being bolted into everything nowadays. But honestly, I don't think we need it really for just TV. Like for example, here it has this new personalized picture setting that you can go through that will show you a set of pictures and you will need to select based on your preference, which is cool and all, but not something we really need, honestly. AI makes sense for gaming stuff like probably DLSS or frame gen. I know it's a hot take, but for the TV itself, not really necessary for me. And then in terms of the built-in speakers for the LG C5, it's fine. It's not great, but honestly, I'd still recommend using a soundbar for it. So we're actually still using here the soundbar that came bundled with the X90H, which is this Sony HT-S20R, and it works perfectly fine with the C5 through eARC. So it also doesn't obstruct the screen at all, and we're running it on the included stand, not really wall mounted or anything. The soundbar's height is around 2.1 inch for reference. For comparison, here's also a quick sound test between the TV's built-in speakers compared to the soundbar that we have here. And then just one shared feature that's worth mentioning here as well. Both remotes actually have a built-in microphone for voice navigation. So if you want to do search or even looking for menus or settings or switching inputs, it works well for both actually. Now, if you're a gamer, especially if you're trying to actually maximize a PS5 Pro or similar, my answer is simple here: go get the OLED. The visual payoff is real. But if you're mostly like just watching TVs or Netflix and chill, so it's more or less the same between the C5 and the X90H. So my wife and I watch a lot of Netflix here and outside of dark scenes specifically, so I don't notice a dramatic difference around it. So on budget, if you already had the money back then to spend for an X90H, most probably you already have the budget as well for on OLED now too, especially the C5. It's a bit discounted right now, being it a year older when you compare it to the C6 as mentioned. But if you're someone that's prioritizing max brightness and all that, probably maybe the G series is for you. Personally, for me, it's not something that I prioritize, specifically the brightness. I don't really want a screen that's too bright especially since I'm a software developer, so I'm mostly staring at a screen all day already. I want my TV time to be comfortable and not another source of eye strain. On the navigation stuff, yeah, there's a bit of a learning curve at the start, especially that input switching thing. But once you know where things are, it actually becomes second nature. It's not really a long-term deal breaker, but something more of a adjustment period. So was it worth it for me and Skiffy? Definitely. Especially for gaming and maximizing the PS5 Pro. Again, if you're just mainly watching shows, the case is a lot less urgent. And that is it for this review. If this has helped you decide whether an OLED is the right buy for you in this kind of setup, smash that like button and subscribe. Let me know down in the comments. So X90H owners, are you tempted yet? So once again, this has been Stevie and Skippy, and we'll see you guys on the next one. Chic. Chic.